Very good. I think we're there. Let me get us started here. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today for our bi-monthly Bridge Michigan Culture Club event. My name is Amber DeLinde. I'm the Membership and Engagement Director here at Bridge Michigan. And today we are discussing We Kept Our Towns Going, the Gossard Girls of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. As I mentioned, today's event is hosted by Bridge Michigan. I just told you who I am. I also would like to introduce my colleague, Jackie Garrett, who is joining us on the call. If you have any questions during today's conversation, Jackie is monitoring the chat. So if you have questions for our special guest, please feel free to type those into the chat at any time today. We're going to ask that folks who aren't our speakers stay muted throughout today's conversation, but we welcome your comments in the chat and we look forward to seeing what you have to say there. Just in case you aren't familiar with us, if this is your first time to a Bridge Michigan Culture event, Bridge Michigan is Michigan's nonprofit, nonpartisan news source, covering issues that matter to you and to your community. If you aren't already, you can subscribe for free by visiting bridgemi.com. One other thing I'd like to mention is that those who are current Bridge Club members, who are people who have donated any amount to Bridge over the last year, receive a number of benefits, including access to free electronic copies of each Bridge Culture Club selection. You can become a member today by visiting the link that will drop in the chat in just a moment. Today, we are so lucky to be joined by author Phyllis Wong. I'll give a full introduction of Phyllis momentarily. Like to start by saying we're incredibly honored that she was willing to join us for this discussion today of her book. The schedule for today looks like this. I will introduce our special guest. I'll then lead a discussion with Phyllis about the book for approximately 40 minutes, and then we will turn to your questions for the remainder of the discussion. We will conclude right at 1 o'clock because we want to make sure that we value your time. So I encourage you to pull up a chair at your lunch and a beverage if you'd like and enjoy the discussion. As you heard at the beginning of the conversation, we are recording this discussion.
Yeah, but I can't hear it.
If we could ask everyone who is not a speaker to mute, I'd really appreciate it. All right, so we are recording today's discussion. We'll be posting that recording on our website, bridgemi.com, either later this afternoon or this week. So if you'd like to watch it again, you're welcome to do so. But now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our special guest, Phyllis Wong. I'd like to read to you now her biography. Oral histories provide the nuances that help make history more vibrant, according to Phyllis M. Wong, who spent much of her life listening, recording, and reacting to the stories of people's lives. Among her early historical research was her graduate thesis, focusing on the history of childhood in the United States during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Later, she would perform oral history interviews of Great Plains residents for Barnes County Historical Society in North Dakota. Her most recent research is on women working in the Gossard Company factories in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the 20th century and what impact they had economically and socially on their small rural hometowns. The resulting book, We Kept Our Towns Going, was the recipient of 2 notable book awards, the 2023 Michigan Notable Book Awards and the 2023 Upper Peninsula Notable Book Awards. Phyllis, a native of the San Francisco Bay Area, would follow her father's sage advice of listen, talk little, listen, in her roles as a historian, educator, including as a writing instructor and director of online learning, and a 30-year member of university-level academic world, including as a first lady at Northern Michigan University and San Francisco State University. Among her favorite First Lady accomplishments are co-founding a One Book, One Community countywide reading program at NMU and pioneering an inclusive student-run fashion show at SFSU that brought together students with disabilities, faculty, fashion industry professionals, and community members. Phyllis earned a bachelor's degree from the Evergreen College and a master's degree from Pacific Lutheran University. She and her husband, Les, have lived and worked in the Northwest, Southwest, Midwest, and West Coast, and have traveled extensively across the United States and the world. Now retired, they reside in the Northeast. Phyllis enjoys spending time with her 3 sons and their families, exploring new places, hiking, photographing Mother Nature during the season of white, and listening for the next story to tell. One quick note before I welcome Phyllis. Phyllis will be attending the 2023 Michigan Notable Book Awards this month in April in Lansing at the Michigan Library. The evening event, is open to the public, although there is a registration fee. And I will drop a link in the chat for where you can learn more information about that event. Without any further ado, welcome, Phyllis. Thank you so much for being here. Oh, Phyllis, you're muted.
All righty. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, members of Bridge, Michigan, the book club members. Thank you very much for being here. But I would certainly be remiss if I did not mention a huge thank you to the many Gossard girls and some men who shared their stories with me. This book would not be where it is today without their generosity to share their own history.
Well, thank you, Phyllis. We are just so honored to have you here today. I think I can speak for the many folks on today's call is that this book was fascinating. I learned many new things, and it was something that it was overwhelmingly popular amongst our readers. We had more than 500 requests from members for the book, many registrants for today's event. So it certainly is a topic that is resonating today with current readers and both Michigan residents, and I'm sure some mixed Michigan expats who are also on the call. But to get us started, I wondered if you would tell us a bit about yourself and your history as a Michigan resident and why you chose to write We Kept Our Towns Going.
Sure. So thank you for that biography. I'd like to go back and reiterate a couple of points from my biography, that I was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area in a very small city, perhaps about 25,000 people. But what was interesting about it is its main industries were agriculture, wines, growing vineyards, making wine, ranching, and 2 national laboratories, research laboratories. You can imagine how interesting that would be to be in that kind of community. And in those days, you sort of had the run of the area. You didn't have to worry. You just kind of walked everywhere, anywhere you wanted to go. I am a retired educator at the university level, and I am most proud. My most favorite job still is having been a mother. I took my job seriously, and I'm confident that I have raised 3 fine young they're not young any longer, but 3 human beings who are making contributions to our world today. That gives me great pride. And I am a proud grandmother of 8 grandchildren. I call them good medicine. Young people are wonderful to be around. I tell everybody, if you're around young people, it's good medicine. Enjoy it. And my 8 grandchildren do that very same thing for me. My husband of 51 years. That would be a story. That's another time for another story of how we got together. But the joy that we've had to live in all different areas of America. This is what we have enjoyed immensely. One consequence of that is that I learned how to appreciate Mother Nature in its varied backgrounds, arid areas, lush areas, in-between areas. And I learned from that in my appreciation of Mother Nature, how beautiful it was, particularly in the season of white. I see snow as a very sculptural medium. And so my camera goes with me every time I'm out in the beautiful white. And all of that leads me to say that one of the more interesting and wonderful places I had the good fortune to live for 8 years was in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My husband accepted a position as president of the university there, and it's a place that I had never visited before, knew nothing about, but can say that I fell in love with it that first day, not just because of the nature, but because of the people there. So I was there for 8 years, and I took it upon myself that if I was going to be in a new community, just as other communities, it was my responsibility to integrate myself, not just at the university community, but in the wider community. And that is where I happened upon this untold story. I was a member of a study group, and one of the women in today's Zoom chat was a member of it, called the Century Club. One year, we were asked to think about a large question, women who made a difference. And being new to Marquette, I said, well, history is my background. Let's find out what's new in history. So my friend Carolyn and I pursued research about a woman there named Geraldine Gordon DeFont, a woman who had come up in the 40s to Ishpeming to organize. And in the process of doing a paper on her, I was charged with finding women and interviewing them for what they knew about Geraldine. What I discovered through my interview process, and it was wonderful, is that these women had little information about Geraldine, but they had a lot of information about their own work. So I knew from that point on, I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more, and I kept knowing more and kept being able to talk to people about what I had learned, because this history, for the most part, was not known, even in local communities. So in a sense, I was sort of bringing this out. And then at some point, and in the book, it talks about this, I'm sure some of your readers have come across that time in which I knew I had to be the one to tell the story. And that realization came in 2010 at a big talk that I gave at Northern Michigan University, when it became apparent to me that the audience was a bit surprised that two of the Gossard girls, retired ones that were there, didn't have the same viewpoint about history. And it was at that point where, on the spot, I said, history is the collective voices of people. History is not just about one person. And so what we have here in this book are the collective voices of assembly line workers. I've been told, unusual to have so many voices, but voices of assembly line workers.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful to sort of understand a bit about sort of how this subject came to you and sort of the way that you became part of a community. Thank you. Speaking of sort of the way the book came together, I'm very curious about your experience in writing We Kept Our Towns Going. I'm curious about sort of how you were able to assemble the stories into a narrative. And a little bit about your choice to use primary sources, kind of letting the Gossard girls speak for themselves, and curious about that choice and why it was so important to you.
I think from the outset, I'm sort of going to go backwards in answering your question, is that I thought that the value of this story would come from the people who lived in that time period. And I didn't care that they had differing viewpoints, because that's really, really about history and about human beings. We don't have the same viewpoint. So what I did was most of my interviews were recorded, and most of them were probably about 35, 40 minutes. Elaine Peterson, who was just amazing, I interviewed her probably at least 30 hours. She was amazing. I learned a tremendous amount from her. So I interviewed people, and then I didn't write up the interviews right away. I would listen to them, whether I was at home, whether I was on the airplane, whether I was in the car writing, writing, R-I-D-I-N-G, not W-R. I would listen. And in doing so, those voices just sort of became more and more part of me. And then when it came time to write, then I recorded everything that was said. And then when it came time to assemble things in some chronological way, then I had to go back again and reread. and to figure out where was the best place this voice belonged. And even though some of their work period overlapped decades, I had to make decisions and choices. And unfortunately, I had to make choices about how many full biographies I could use. And that's based on what the publisher dictates. So is that helpful? Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. One thing that it seemed that struck me about this book being different than some other sort of historical books that I've read is that oftentimes there might be an account from someone, but I felt sometimes as though the author was sort of shaping a narrative. And one thing that I really admired about this book is that I felt as though you were letting these women tell their own stories and not sort of guiding it toward a point that that you had sort of a thesis that was being laid out. Can you tell us a little bit about that and whether, that was your intention from the beginning?
That was purposeful from the beginning. Maybe I shouldn't say the beginning. It was purposeful, and I certainly came to that recognition. I wanted people to know from the storyteller's viewpoint how things happen. What I felt about what they did was immaterial, and that if I had enough of them gathered together, that the many voices would weigh in and readers would understand the complexity and the vibrancy of what life was like for these people. I begin my book, there's a quote in the beginning of my book, I think it's in the foreword or prologue, I'm not sure where I said, "You will never know what someone is thinking unless you give them a voice." And I didn't think about that idea until actually I was writing the book, but intuitively I must have thought about that as I was interviewing them. Because when you interview people, you have to listen. To listen means that you have to empty your brain, your mind, your soul to really hear what they are saying. And then the process of reading and rereading and rereading and listening helped me at least assemble these stories. I spoke to one of my interviewees last week. She's 105 years old. Yeah, 105 years old. And I'll never forget when I spoke to her the first time, which was not the first time, when I spoke to her last year, after the book was published, she looked me in the eyes and she thanked me. She said, "You told our stories. You didn't tell your story. This is how it really happened."
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That actually, I had a question along those lines. I realize that many of the Gossard girls have now passed on, but obviously there's at least one that you maintain communications with. Do you ever hear from any of the other Gossard girls or their families?
I do. I've been in communication with a few other Gossard girls. Mind you, I did the book launch in Marquette County last year.
Great.
And the people there, I cannot say enough about the people of the UP. There were so many events and so many people turned out. I got to revisit and get to know new people who were related to Gossard workers. I have been interviewing sons and daughters of Gossard workers, which again is planting another seed in my head about, well, if people are willing to talk to me, what can I do to make sure their stories continue on? So yes, I never tire of listening, never.
It's very cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mind sharing, did any of the Gossard girls stories particularly stick with you, and why was that story or those stories so impactful?
Mm-hmm. That's a really tough question to answer because so many of the stories are very, very important. But when I think about stories that represent larger groups of Gossard girls, I think of Cecilia Kangas. She's representative of women who decided not to continue their education. They came from large families. Their fathers were miners. Wasn't enough money in their large families for them to help keep the family going. And so these young people, 14, Cecilia was 14 when she made that difficult choice, telling her mother, you didn't finish your education. Why do I have to finish mine? I'm going to stop. Rose Colic was another one of 11 who did the very same thing. So Cecilia Kangas is also representative of the what I'll call the first generation, immigrant generation workers. And her stories about what it was like to grow up in ethnic neighborhoods. So ethnic neighborhoods in Ishpeming might have been Italians and Finns in the same area. And so you might have had, she talks about playing outside and children were yelling at each other in their own first language. So yes, but the work itself, the tough work itself of being in an undergarment company and what that was like. I think of Rose Colic, who worked in many different areas. Again, a woman who had to work, who had to help support her family, of all of the challenges of what it was like as a young person. Imagine you are 14 or 16. These are people who lied about their age, okay, to work there. And now you're in on a shaft with people who are older than you. Some could easily be your mother. Some might even be your grandmother. This is your first job, but you're making money. And that's really what motivated these people, is that they could have an impact on their family and tangentially in their communities. Elaine Peterson, I'll tell one more. Elaine Peterson, the woman, I don't know, I've dedicated part of my book to her because she is a person who worked in absolutely every area, but she was a person that was intensely curious about every area that she worked in. And because of that, we, the readers, are lucky because we really have a good understanding of what it was like to work at the Gossard, particularly Chapter 2, when Elaine was immensely helpful in helping me visualize and put together some sequential stuff. Now, that's not everything, but it's quite a bit to help the reader understand. And then Elaine Peterson, a woman who learned quickly about, she started working in the during the war period and then had to quickly go back home when she knew that there was some terrible stuff and she was too young to stay working in DC. So she goes back home and again learns through the processes of many jobs that she has. She sees the unfairness in, you know, in the shafts with the piece workers. And she felt that. She was young, a teenager. She started when she was 18 and then signed a campaign card and was very, very proactive and pro-union and helped a lot of women, especially during the strike period. Women who didn't want to go on the picket line, but who knew that from talking to Elaine, the value of what would happen. They would eat. Why was that important? Because at that time in 49, some of the miners were laid off. I mean, mining was up and down, and therein lies the silver lining of why the Gossard girls were able to make such a huge impact in not just Ishpeming, but in Gwynn, in Marquette County.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's really, I loved the stories, but to hear sort of the story behind the story helps as well. It's really fascinating. You mentioned sort of how many of the women who worked in the Gossard factories were immigrants. I was curious, when you, in your interviews, did you get a sense for how women of various backgrounds and traditions got along in the Gossard factories? How did people interact and get to know one another?
I suppose in all fairness, no, I would say I didn't get a sense of things. However, when I have, mind you, what we have to understand is that these women were seated next to each other. And maybe you might have had two women who were Finnish, and maybe they only spoke Finnish. Well, they'd probably speak Finnish to each other, but then the person on their right, if that person spoke English, then there'd have to be that other part where they would have to start speaking English. I'm reminded of Denise Anderson, an immigrant from Belgium, okay, who came over, who knew no English when she came. She would always have to use a dictionary. She was a war bride, but she didn't even know when she was learning how to be a assembly line worker. She didn't know what the instructor was telling her. She had no idea, but she was smart. Her eyes told her what she should do, and she followed very, very carefully. And so slowly but surely, she would begin to learn English. My interview with her, with many of the immigrants, is I had to make sure I paid close attention to listen carefully to what they were saying. And oftentimes I would repeat what they had told me to ensure that what I heard was what they meant to say. So that was an extra layer, but it was worth it.
Absolutely. Thank you. One part of this book that I just was very touched by was the story of the Gossard girls continuing to gather socially years, even decades after the plant's closures. What were the reasons, do you think, that the camaraderie sustained?
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly can't speak for the other Gossard factories that existed at the time, but what I can say is that what unfortunately is not in my book is a discussion about what the company did purposely beginning in 1920. So the company actually began in about 1904, but in 1920, the owner of the company, Mr. Gossard, wanted to put together, I'll call it an employee magazine, for lack of any other word. So it was a monthly magazine that the company put together. All of the articles and photographs in this lengthy magazine, which was probably about 50 pages, 50, it was called the Gossardian. But all of the articles were submitted by people from factories themselves. So management didn't write them. The women, the workers from the factory wrote them. And that employee magazine, I believe, was intended to create this family feel. Yes, they were out to make money. Workers were out to make money. But somewhere in the middle was this idea that we are part of this family. It's called the Gossard family. Hence, the magazine is called the Gossardian. So I think that that idea, plus what you learn in the magazine itself, was of company-sponsored events. There were always picnics. There were, even in 1920, when the Ishpeming factory was the first one to open, you can find articles about dances in which the company sponsored on the third floor, and the other things like coffee and drinks, and even in the beginning there was a little bit of some food. The cafeteria itself came in the 1940s, but that was well after the magazine, the Gossardian, stopped. So, but in Ishpeming, the company continued to have picnics, Christmas parties. Sometimes they were really lush Christmas parties with people playing instruments, singing, Halloween events, sponsoring a baseball team, men and women, bowling teams. So this sense, so the company, I see the company doing that. Along with that, again, you have these women who are next to each other, and depending upon what machine you use, depended upon how much you could actually talk to the person next to you or across from you, because there were people across from you. So the women just would talk to each other. They got to know each other's family histories. When you know someone, they're not just a worker. And the women actually would use the term Gossard family. One woman talked about how the Gossard women at their church would sit together. Some would go out to camps together. So that whole notion of that remained strong even after the Ishpeming factory closed in 76. Gwyn closed in the middle 60s. And they formed a group. They maintained membership of the group. Probably most people died until about 2008, I think. So that sense of family was really strong. I don't know how I mentioned earlier, I spoke to this woman who was about 105, Verna. Her name is Verna. And she talked to me a little bit about that. She never used the word Gossard family, but she talked about how important it was, the people that sat next to her or across from her. And she would tell me little stories about them, of what, not just as a worker, but as a human being. One woman who was deaf on the line, in the seaming line, and how when they would walk home together, because apparently they lived not far from each other, Verna would make sure that she'd turn her head so that the woman could read her lips. She just wasn't a worker. She was someone she valued. And they stuck together. And I think maybe, could be, I don't know, why eventually that's, the impetus to have a union shop ended up being so successful. I don't know.
Yeah, that actually leads me right into my next question, but thank you for that. It was just a detail that just really, I don't know, it really warmed my heart to read those friendships sustain themselves beyond, a year after the factories closed. And the photos of the picnic were one of my very favorite parts of the book. I loved seeing those. Those were really neat. Of course, the unionization of the Gossard factories was a key subject of the book. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your interviewees had to say about unionization, both for and against? And I was just curious to know, are the Gossard girls well known in labor history?
I will answer your last question. A simple answer is no. Okay. So there were factories all over the Midwest, Canada, the UK, Australia. To my knowledge, in my searches, I find little has been written. I will give credit to a native of Ishpeming, I believe her name is Kristen Lucas, who actually wrote a paper, and it might even be a chapter in a book about the strike itself, but nothing about the 6 decades of Ishpeming's and Gwyn's history. So nothing has been done. This is I guess I've been told it's a seminal history. But backing up a bit to your initial inquiry about the strike itself, that I will admit was probably one of the more difficult parts of the story to tell. Why? I think could be a factor of reasons. One is that many of the people I happened to talk to had little information about the strike, other than saying that my father was in the union, so I supported unions, or my father did not support unions, or the fact that one woman said, I was too young, I didn't know what was going on, so I just went along with things. Or someone else might have said, I was too young, I didn't understand it, so I was not going to vote for a union shop. People like Helmy in the book, people like Elaine in the book, people like Rose Collick, who, by the way, if you read about her, she was not working at the factory during the strike period, and yet she was a pro-union person, and the workers could take time and sit in her garage and make sure that no one was trying to sneak into the building to go past the strikers. So the reasons are all over the board about what people were thinking. Elaine was a tremendous help during that. Helmy also was another person. Dorothy Waters, it's a number of them that were helpful in just giving me small things about what they saw. So the picture of what we have in the book, chapter 4, is another way to look at what was happening. And I kind of think, I believe that this is a really important chapter because Ruth Crane, who was the head of the effort to unionize the Ishpeming factory, her letters are incredibly invaluable, and I believe support the notion that there was a reason why eventually the workers would want a union shop. No one was sticking up for them. And the examples that she gives in her letters are very, very helpful for readers to understand that union shops don't just happen. Something is there that pushes the worker to think a little more carefully and to wonder and to, at some point, have to take a side for or against.
Thank you very much. It was just a fascinating look into the ground level of sort of a labor question, and it's very rare that you get that.
Yeah, it was a very emotional time. In no way do I want to minimize that. Passions rang high. When everything was done after that 16 weeks and that unfortunate accident, people went back to work, and that's what you did. You went back to work, you made money. Why? Because you could make a difference.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you. My next question actually aligns with a question that just came into the chat. I'm curious to know, how do you think the Gossard girls' work and the placement of the Gossard factories in Ishpeming and Gwyn impacted the region, both then and now? Is there a continued impact even though the factories have closed?
That's a really good question. Why did the factories end up where they did? Well, it was maybe several things I think that came together. One is keeping in mind the two primary industries in the Upper Peninsula, mining and logging. Okay, so what did that mean? That meant that there were a lot of families, a lot of women, a lot of mothers, a lot of daughters. So the labor force was deep. Lots of people who could work there. Then the second piece I would say is that there was an empty building, that giant building, what used to be called the Brasted building, a huge, huge department store in its day that unfortunately didn't last more than maybe, I think, three years. So imagine you are you're a businessman in downtown Ishpeming in 1920, and this giant department store is empty. The taxes for the city are going way down. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Well, therein comes what I believe are the astute businessmen of Ishpeming, the association there. And they go down to Chicago. They, as luck would have it, because oftentimes it is luck, they met someone who actually had roots in the UP, but also someone who could connect them with the Gossard, a company called the Gossard, who was looking to open up new factories. And so all of those things aligned within 3 months. Imagine that today. Imagine that.
Fairly rare. I would, at this juncture, obviously the plants have closed. Is there, in your perception, is there a continued economic impact or even cultural impact of the Gossard factories in the Marquette County area?
That's a really, really good question. Certainly when the Gossard was going on for the 6 decades, the downtown area was reaped huge, huge benefits. Most of the businesses were owned by men. Most of them were. Those women spent their money not only in Ishpeming, but the Gwyn people in that factory there, a much smaller town, but they spent their money in Gwyn also. So when you have, payroll being deposited in your city and then people spending it, then that means that your city is very, very vibrant. And so it was vibrant. And then when everything closed, 60s and 70s, you didn't have that economic base, that the taxes, the wages going back into the community. And so slowly businesses would close. And today, I would say those communities have not entirely recovered from that. There are efforts to get back to being more economically vibrant, particularly in Ishpeming that I am aware of. The building itself is a mixed use building. There are many offices in there, in addition to the building itself being a museum of sorts where people who walk in can see things. So I often describe Ishpeming, I use the adjective tired to describe it, because for me, community is so, so important. And my memories and of being there were very important, but I knew even when I was there in 2008, I could see that the community used to be way more vibrant than it was in 2008. And I was hopeful, I still am hopeful that I know that they are moving in that direction, but they will continue to move in that direction, as well as Gwyn.
Thank you. Speaking of sort of Ishpeming and Gwyn, if our readers were to go to Ishpeming or Gwyn or other towns in the Upper Peninsula to learn more about the Gossard girls, are there any places you'd recommend that they stop or anything that they should seek out?
Mm-hmm. So I would say that in Marquette, the Regional History Center has a lot of Gossard artifacts. I don't know how many are always on display, but that certainly is a resource. In Ishpeming itself, there's the Ishpeming Historical Society, which I know has a lot of things, but the building itself, if nothing else, I heartily encourage people, if you are ever in this area, make that one of your stops. The owners of the building, the previous owners, they just recently sold it to some new people, but that building is a living history. Maybe living is not the right word. I don't know what is, but you can go in there and you can see photos and artifacts. So in Ishpeming itself and in Gwyn itself, again, the Forsyth Township Historical Museum would be a place. Or if you were really lucky, you might happen to meet a former Gossard worker. Now that, or one of their children. Now that would be a treat.
No kidding. Absolutely. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to some reader questions, if that's okay with you. So quite a few have come in through the chat. So I just will turn to a few of those now and see how many we can get to in our time remaining here. One of our readers asked, are any of the actual undergarments still in existence? And did you see any of them or photos of them? I'm not sure everyone's edition of the book had all of the photos included. So
yes. Many of the garments from this particular period exist today. I know some are actually on display at Ishpeming's former Gossard, in the Gossard building. I have seen many of them. I was really, really lucky. In many of my talks, unbeknownst to me, at the end, people would come up and give me things. So I had a huge assortment of Gossard undergarments, Gossard artifacts, the cones, the threads, scrap material, an oil can, just any number of things that people gave me that I then donated to the History Center in Marquette.
Very neat.
So they exist. And even today, I think if someone did a Google search, if you probably could find some of those things there. It's very interesting.
It is. Another reader wondered, speaking of sort of the archives of the things, all of the histories that you collected, were your interviews recorded in audio only, or do you have video recordings to accompany any of the interviews?
Primarily, I would say maybe 98% audio, and some are through letters, some were on the phone.
Sure.
I was happy if anybody would talk.
Absolutely. Another person, a lot of historians here on this. They're curious to know if there are copies of the Gossard magazine, the Gossardian magazine, in a library or anywhere that could be viewed.
I'm not aware of any in the library. I am aware that, for example, in Ishpeming's Historical Museum, they probably have some. I actually was given some. I have some, not very many. I think I might have 2 of them. They're fabulous. I encourage historians. It's really a good resource for learning about what life was like. And for example, in the Gossardian, at the end of it, there are some fun games that the workers could play, word games, number games, and then also the equivalent of what I would say are snippets about so-and-so going to visit so-and-so, so-and-so got married, so-and-so had a baby. So it's a really good resource for social history.
So neat. It's hard to imagine such a thing today, but that's really quite cool.
That's a really good point. Think about that. How many businesses today, that was an investment in those days, to invest in your workers again in such a way. How many? I don't know. Maybe there are companies. I just don't know.
Really fascinating. Yeah. Another reader was curious to know, is the quilt at Northern Michigan University, is it viewable? Could the public see it?
The Gossard quilt, actually, I donated it to the Historical Society in Marquette. That the story, the chapter in the book or the article is not even the full story. It's a very, very interesting story how that all came about and why it came about. So unfortunately, because things are donated, you never know when something is going to be on display. But that kind of gives me an idea about maybe it would be important for me to see that there is a place for people if they want to see it. It's a work of art done by 4 women, most who did not know each other, and came together to work on something to honor Gossard workers in a significant way. And when it was on display at the library, the Peter White Library, I would hear from people who said that they saw this and what it meant to them, and including the woman who donated to me all of the scraps so that I then could pass them on to people who knew how to put something together. It made a difference, and it was very interesting when I think about quilts, how important quilts are as artifacts of history. I spoke to a number of women and saw a number of quilts in my interviews. And this is really what it is, what these quilts mean. They're just not some piece of fabric from leftover material, but it's what you don't see that makes that particular piece so important.
Imagine all of the work that goes into them.
Mm-hmm.
Incredible. A reader wondered, after doing all of the research to write We Kept Our Towns Going, are there lessons from Ishpeming and Gwyn as far as that could be applied today when we have so many of our smaller towns who are struggling? Are there lessons for today from what was able to be created through the work that happened at the Gossard factories?
Yeah. whoever asked that question, I tip my hat to that person. That is something that has been weighing on me as one of the lessons, at least that I have come to learn, actually what the Gossard girls told me and has told all of us about what happens. What happens when you bring industry, small or large, to a small town? Well, what happens is that people work. When people work, they make money. When they make money, they spend their money. They spend their money oftentimes in the community. They keep what the Gossard girls said, they keep their towns going. It seems like a silly thing to say, or everybody knows it, but I suppose maybe the challenge is, how do we help those who can open a factory, can open a business? How do we help them understand not just the economic, but the social benefits that came about as a result of it? And that's not easy, but I hope that some people will prevail, that there will be those people out there that might begin to think about that in more deliberate ways. I would love to see that happen. These women took pride. They took pride in their work. If you were a Gossard girl, you were socially elevated. Why? You made money.
Right.
A job means you have income. A job means you can take care of your family. A job means you can help your city. You can help your community. Your community. Pretty powerful.
Absolutely. We only have time for maybe one, maybe two more questions. Suzanne just asked, did you hear from any of the Gossard girls about how their work affected their health? Were any of them impacted by the white lung from the lid that happened, that was produced by the machines?
Yes, I did. So Cecilia Kangas pops in my mind first. By the time she grew older, her hearing was really bad. She couldn't hear as well. Another woman, a beautiful Madeline Del Bello from Gwynn, one of my favorite ones too, who worked there the whole time it was open. She, in the interview, I will never forget, she shows me her hand. She says, "Look there, can you see that? That's an impression made from using that presser, holding it the whole time." She says, "That's nothing. I made money. I kept my family together."
Wow.
Some women, yes, some women, there were accidents, but I didn't hear of any serious accidents. Doesn't mean they didn't happen. I am just simply not aware of them.
That's good news. Thank you. We're coming up right to the end. I'm going to, in just a moment, pass things over to my colleague, Jackie. But before I do, is there anything you want readers to know? Anything you want them to be aware of? Anything we should be looking out from you, Phyllis, that readers should know about? Like anything you're working on that they could look into?
Oh, I have some things up here that I'm working on. I am full-time marketing my book, trying to make sure the story finds its way into new places. So I have not done much, but things are up here right now. I will tell your readers. I have learned a lot by listening to so many people and through this book, and it's impressed upon me the importance, again, of listening. So I'm on the lookout for more stories of listening. What are the stories about people we don't think about, and yet their stories are important stories for our collective history. I'm interested in finding that journey, that path that most people might not be on.
Very interesting.
I hope to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for being so generous with your time and for collecting these stories. I think I can speak for 100 people who are on this conversation that we are also glad that you did so. I loved the book, and many people did, as well as I can see their faces smiling at us right now.
Well, again, if I may, I really would like to thank people. When I thank them for listening. I've done a lot of talking today, and I really like to listen, but I thank you, everyone out there, for listening. You now know what these people did. Please share. Please share. Have a wonderful day.
Absolutely. Thank you, Phyllis. I'm going to pass things over now to my friend and colleague, Jackie, to close us out for the day.
Wonderful. For those of us who are hanging on the line, just give us a moment and I would love to tie us up. Thank you again, Phyllis, and the broader Bridge team, as well as, most importantly, thank you to all the participants who spent your valuable, precious lunch breaks potentially with us today. We are so appreciative of it, and it's always good to come together as a group. I would like to remind you all, this recording will be available on Bridge Michigan's website later this week. So do keep an eye out if you'd like to revisit it or share it out. The Culture Club will be resuming in June, and that announcement will be coming soon. A little teaser there is that the next subject of the Culture Club will be a film. So keep your eyes and ears open, and we will be sending out notification of that coming very soon. And a reminder that if you'd like to be eligible to receive our next Culture Club selection, it is a complimentary benefit of being a Bridge Club member. So if you would like to become a member, please do so today, and you can receive that benefit. You'll receive the June selection as a part of your membership as well. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.